1,911 miles, built in 6 years. With pickaxes, with shovels, with black powder and bare hands. 20,000 men, most of them immigrants who'd crossed an ocean looking for opportunity, who found themselves breaking rocks in the desert, blasting through mountains, laying iron across terrain that most Americans thought was uninhabitable. They built a railroad that connected 2 oceans. They reduced a 6-month journey to less than a week. They created the infrastructure that would define America for the next century. And they did it with hand tools and determination, dying by the hundreds, working for wages that barely kept them alive, building something that most engineers said was impossible. This was America between 1863 and 1869, and the country was attempting something that had never been done. A railroad stretching from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. Through the Great Plains, where there was no timber, no stone, nothing but grass and wind. Through the Rocky Mountains, where the grades were too steep and the snow too deep. Through the Sierra Nevada, where the granite was too hard and the passes too high. Through the Nevada desert, where there was no water. 2 companies building from opposite ends, racing toward each other, each mile earning government subsidies and land grants. The Union Pacific Building west from Council Bluffs, Iowa. The Central Pacific Building east from Sacramento, California. And both companies hiring anyone willing to do the work. Irish fleeing famine, Chinese fleeing poverty, Civil War veterans looking for jobs, freed slaves heading west. Thousands of men who would spend years of their lives moving earth with shovels, breaking rock with sledgehammers, and laying iron in conditions that killed a significant percentage of them. Could humans really build a railroad across an entire continent using only hand tools? Could you blast through mountains, span rivers, and cross deserts without mechanized equipment? Could you organize 20,000 workers, most of whom didn't speak English, many of whom had never seen a railroad before, and coordinate them to build something this massive? And even if you could build it, what was the human cost? How many men would die? How many would be injured? And would anyone remember their names after it was done? Before we get to the building, you need to understand what the Transcontinental Railroad was actually trying to accomplish. Because this wasn't just about laying track, this was about connecting a country that was effectively split in 2. In 1860, if you wanted to travel from New York to California, you had 3 options. You could take a ship around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, a journey of 6 months through some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. You could take a ship to Panama, cross the isthmus on foot or by mule, and catch another ship on the Pacific side. Faster, but still months, and incredibly risky, because Panama was disease-ridden. Or you could travel overland by wagon train. 6 months of brutal travel through territory where you face starvation, disease, attacks, and exposure. None of these options were practical for regular travel or commerce. You couldn't build a national economy when it took 6 months to move goods from one coast to the other. You couldn't maintain political unity when the 2 halves of the country were effectively isolated from each other. The Transcontinental Railroad would change all of that. Once completed, the journey from coast to coast would take less than a week. Goods could be shipped efficiently. People could relocate. The entire development of the American West depended on having reliable transportation connecting it to the eastern states. Congress authorized the railroad in 1862 in the middle of the Civil War. The Pacific Railroad Act designated 2 companies to build it. The Union Pacific would build west from Council Bluffs. The Central Pacific would build east from Sacramento. They would meet somewhere in the middle. Each company would receive government bonds, essentially loans, of $16,000 per mile of track on flat ground, $32,000 per mile in the foothills, and $48,000 per mile in the mountains. They would also receive land grants, sections of land along the railroad that they could sell to settlers to raise capital. This created an incentive to build as many miles as possible. The more track you laid, the more money and land you received. It also created a race. The meeting point wasn't predetermined. Wherever the 2 railroads met would be the dividing line between their territories and subsidies. So both companies were motivated to build as fast as possible to claim more miles and more money. The Union Pacific started construction in 1865, delayed by the Civil War. Their route was across the Great Plains and through the Rocky Mountains. The terrain wasn't as difficult as what the Central Pacific faced, but it had its own challenges. The plains were flat but exposed, no natural shelter, extremes of temperature, and crucially, no timber. Every railroad tie, every support beam, every piece of wood needed for construction had to be shipped in from hundreds of miles away. The Union Pacific workforce was primarily Irish immigrants. Ireland had experienced the Great Famine in the 1840s, and millions had fled to America. Many ended up on the East Coast in cities like New York and Boston, working low-wage jobs. The Union Pacific recruited heavily from these Irish communities, offering steady work at good wages, $2 to $3 a day, plus room and board. That was better than most alternatives. And so thousands of Irish men signed on. They also hired Civil War veterans, both Union and Confederate. The war had ended in 1865, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers were looking for work. Many had experience with organization, discipline, and hard physical labor. The Union Pacific offered them a chance to continue working in structured teams, doing difficult work for decent pay. Some of these veterans had engineering skills from military service. Others were just strong backs willing to dig and haul. The work started simple, grading the roadbed. This meant creating a level surface for the tracks to sit on. In flat terrain, it was straightforward. You'd dig out high spots and fill in low spots until you had a smooth, level grade. But even on the plains, this was backbreaking labor. You're working with shovels and wheelbarrows. A man might move 10 cubic yards of dirt in a day. That's roughly 8 tons of earth. Lifted, moved, dumped, hour after hour, day after day. The crews worked in coordinated teams. Graders would move ahead of the track layers, preparing the roadbed. Then the tie gang would come through, placing wooden ties across the grade every few feet. Then the iron gang would lay the rails, iron bars weighing 700 pounds each, 40 feet long. 4 men per rail, lifting and placing. The rails would be spiked to the ties, 10 spikes per rail, driven with sledgehammers by workers called Gandy dancers. The rhythm of the sledgehammers became a signature sound of railroad construction. You could hear it from miles away, the systematic pounding of iron on iron, synchronized between crews, echoing across the plains. The Union Pacific laid track at a rate of about 1 to 2 miles per day, in good conditions on flat ground. That required moving thousands of tons of material, rails, ties, spikes, tools, food, water, to the end of the track every day. They used the railroad itself to do this. Supply trains would run to the end of the completed track, unload materials, then back up as the track was extended forward. It was a self-sustaining system, but it required precise coordination. The workers lived in camps that moved with the railroad. These weren't permanent towns. They were temporary settlements of tents and rough shacks that would exist for a few weeks or months and then be abandoned as the railroad moved forward. The camps were rough. Men slept 10 to 20 in a tent. Food was basic: beans, salt, pork, bread, coffee. There was no fresh food. No vegetables. Scurvy was common. Dysentery killed dozens. And violence was constant. The camps attracted gamblers, prostitutes, liquor dealers. Towns that sprang up at major supply points were nicknamed Hell on Wheels because of the lawlessness. The daily routine for a railroad worker started before dawn. You'd wake up in a crowded tent where the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and stale breath. You'd pull on clothes that were stiff with dried sweat and dirt. You'd eat breakfast, usually just coffee and bread, maybe some bacon if the supply train had come through recently. Then you'd walk to the work site, often a mile or more from camp, carrying your tools. The workday was 10 to 12 hours in summer, shorter in winter when daylight was limited. You'd work without stopping except for a brief lunch break at midday. So the lunch was usually the same as breakfast: bread, maybe some salt pork, water, then back to work until dark. By the time you got back to camp, you were too exhausted to do anything but eat dinner and collapse into your bunk. There were no days off. You worked 7 days a week. The only breaks were when weather made work impossible. Blizzards in winter, severe storms that made the ground too muddy to work. Some workers would go months without a rest day. The constant physical labor broke men down. Backs gave out, joints wore out, men in their 30s looked 50. Men in their 40s couldn't do the work anymore and were sent away. Among the Union Pacific workers was a man named Michael Murphy, an Irish immigrant who'd come to America in 1863 after his family's potato crops failed for 3 years running. And Murphy worked on the railroad from 1866 to 1869, starting as a grader and eventually becoming a foreman. His letters home to his sister in Boston, preserved in a historical collection, provide one of the few first-hand accounts of what the work was actually like. In one letter from 1867, he wrote, "We are moving 5,000 tons of earth per mile. That is the weight of it, Mary, and every pound moved by men with shovels. I have never been so tired. I have never seen men work so hard. Some fall down from exhaustion and cannot rise again." The workers were paid monthly. Many would spend their entire paycheck in the first few days on whiskey and gambling. Then they'd work the rest of the month with no money, sometimes in debt to company stores that sold supplies on credit. The cycle was designed to keep workers trapped. If you quit, you'd leave with nothing. If you stayed, you'd at least have room and board, even if you couldn't save any money. The Central Pacific faced different challenges. Their route went east from Sacramento, which meant immediately climbing into the Sierra Nevada. They had to gain 7,000 feet of elevation in 100 miles, blasting through solid granite, crossing passes that receive 40 feet of snow annually. And they had a labor problem. White workers on the West Coast could make better money in the gold and silver mines. Nobody wanted to do railroad work for $2 a day when you could potentially strike it rich in a mine. Charles Crocker, who supervised Central Pacific construction, made a controversial decision in 1865. He started hiring Chinese workers. There were thousands of Chinese immigrants in California, most of them working in mines or doing menial labor. They were paid less than white workers and faced severe discrimination. Crocker initially hired 50 Chinese workers as an experiment. The white foreman predicted they'd fail. They were too small, too weak to do railroad work. The Chinese workers proved everyone wrong. They worked harder, complained less, and were more efficient than white crews. Within months, Crocker was hiring Chinese workers by the thousands. By 1867, the Central Pacific workforce was approximately 90% Chinese, roughly 12,000 men. They came directly from China, recruited through labor contractors in Guangdong province. They'd pay for passage to America, arrive in San Francisco, and be immediately put to work on the railroad. The work the Chinese crews faced was some of the hardest manual labor in American history. They were blasting tunnels through solid granite. The Cape Horn section, where the railroad had to be carved into a cliff face 1,500 feet above the American River, required workers to be lowered down the cliff in wicker baskets. They'd swing against the rock face, drill holes with hand drills, pack the holes with black powder, light the fuses, and signal to be pulled up before the explosion. If the fuse was too short, or if they couldn't be pulled up fast enough, they'd be killed by the blast or fall to their deaths. Dozens of Chinese workers died at Cape Horn. The exact number isn't known because the Central Pacific didn't keep detailed records of Chinese casualties. But accounts from the time mention bodies being recovered from the river below, mention rock slides that buried entire crews, mention explosions that went off prematurely. The white foreman would report some Chinese were lost without specifying how many. The workers were treated as expendable. The tunnel work was even worse. The Central Pacific had to blast 15 tunnels through the Sierra Nevada, totaling over 1,700 feet of solid granite. The Summit Tunnel, the longest at 1,659 feet, took over a year to complete. The work was done by hand. Workers would drill holes into the granite using hand drills, steel rods that had to be struck with sledgehammers to slowly bore into the rock. A 4-man crew might drill 20 inches in a 12-hour shift. That's less than 2 inches per hour. Once the holes were drilled, they'd be packed with black powder, the crew would evacuate, and the charge would be detonated. The explosions were dangerous. The tunnels were filled with smoke and dust after each blast. Workers had to go back in before the air cleared to remove the debris. Many died from suffocation or from breathing the toxic fumes. Others were killed when unstable rock collapsed on them. The tunnel work went on through the winter. In the winter of 1866 to 67, the Chinese workers lived and worked under 40 feet of snow, moving through tunnels and passages they dug to connect the barracks to the work sites. The conditions were inhuman. The workers were breathing bad air, eating poor food, working 16-hour days in freezing temperatures. Disease was rampant. Avalanches killed entire crews. One avalanche in January 1867 buried a barracks and killed 23 workers. In spring, when the snow melted, workers would find bodies of men who'd been buried during the winter, preserved in the snow. And through all of this, the Chinese workers were paid $1 per day, half what white workers received. They had to buy their own food. They had to pay for their own tools if they broke or lost them. The Central Pacific made money off their Chinese workers beyond just the labor they provided. The company ran commissaries that sold food and supplies at inflated prices. Workers who complained or tried to organize were fired immediately and blacklisted from other jobs. In June 1867, the Chinese workers went on strike. 5,000 men stopped working simultaneously, demanding higher pay and shorter hours. The Central Pacific responded by cutting off food supplies to the camps. After a week, the workers went back to work without gaining any concessions. The strike failed, but it demonstrated that the Chinese workers understood their value and were willing to fight for better treatment even when the odds were against them. The organization of the strike was remarkable given the circumstances. The Chinese workers had limited ability to communicate with management. Most spoke no English. They organized through their own networks, making decisions in meetings conducted in Chinese, coordinating action across multiple work camps spread over miles of railroad. The strike demands were reasonable. 8-hour workdays instead of 12, and wages increased to match what white workers received. The Central Pacific could have afforded these demands. They chose not to meet them because they feared it would set a precedent. The way the strike was broken reveals how little power the workers actually had. Charles Crocker ordered supply trains to stop delivering food to the camps where Chinese workers lived. Within 3 days, the workers were hungry. Within a week, they were desperate. With no food coming in and no way to get food elsewhere, they were in the middle of the mountains, miles from any town. They had no choice but to return to work on the company's terms. The strike did have one lasting effect. It forced the Central Pacific management to recognize that the Chinese workers weren't simply passive labor. They were organized, they were strategic, and they were essential to completing the railroad. After the strike, conditions improved slightly, not because of generosity, but because Crocker realized that pushing the workers too hard could result in another work stoppage. The improvements were minimal. Slightly better food, slightly shorter hours during the worst of winter. But they were something. Among the Chinese workers was a man known only as Hung Hua in surviving records, who worked as a crew boss overseeing groups of Chinese laborers. Hung Hua was one of the few Chinese workers who spoke English, having learned it working in San Francisco before joining the railroad. He served as an intermediary between the Chinese crews and white foremen. In testimony given years later to a historian studying the railroad, Hung Hua described the tunnel work. "We would drill all day and blast at night. The rock was so hard that sometimes we would drill only a few inches in 12 hours. The men's hands would be bloody from working the drills. The air in the tunnel was bad. Men would faint from the smoke after blasting. We would drag them outside and others would go in to clear the rock. This happened every day." By 1868, both railroads were building at maximum speed. The Union Pacific was racing across Wyoming, laying track through terrain that was flat but hostile. The Central Pacific had finally gotten through the Sierra and was building across Nevada. The two railroads were approaching each other, and the competition intensified. Both companies wanted to lay as many miles as possible before they met. The Union Pacific faced attacks from Native American tribes. The railroad was cutting through traditional hunting grounds, and tribes like the Cheyenne and Lakota saw it as an invasion. There were raids on work camps, or attacks on supply trains, workers killed or driven off. The Union Pacific hired guards, often Civil War veterans, to protect the work crews. There were skirmishes that killed men on both sides. The railroad was being built through contested territory, and the violence was a constant presence. The attacks weren't random violence. They were strategic resistance to an invasion that native tribes understood would fundamentally alter their way of life. The railroad brought white settlers. It brought buffalo hunters who would decimate the herds that tribes depended on for survival. It brought the army, which would use the railroad to supply campaigns against native populations. The tribes fighting the railroad weren't attacking progress. They were defending their homeland against an existential threat. The most serious incident occurred in August 1867 near Plum Creek, Nebraska. A Cheyenne war party removed a section of rail and derailed a freight train. Several railroad workers were killed. The attack prompted the Union Pacific to station Army troops at vulnerable points along the line and to arm work crews with rifles. For months afterward, track laying crews worked with their weapons nearby, ready to defend themselves. The logistics of supplying 20,000 workers spread across hundreds of miles of construction was itself a massive undertaking. Every piece of iron, every railroad tie, every tool, every pound of food had to be transported to the end of track. The Union Pacific used the completed railroad to move supplies, but before the railroad reached a location, everything had to be freighted overland by wagon. Hence, the company operated hundreds of wagons hauling supplies from staging areas in Council Bluffs and Omaha. The iron rails came from mills in Pennsylvania and were shipped by rail to Council Bluffs, then by the Union Pacific to the end of track. Each rail weighed 700 pounds and was 40 feet long. They were transported on flat cars, stacked and secured. A single supply train might carry enough rails for a mile of track, along with ties, spikes, and other materials. These trains ran multiple times per day during peak construction, keeping the work crews supplied. The railroad ties were a major logistical challenge, especially on the plains where there were no trees. The Union Pacific had to source ties from forests hundreds of miles away. They contracted with timber operations in Missouri and Kansas to cut ties to specification, 8 feet long, 8 inches wide, 6 inches thick. The ties were shipped by river to supply depots, then by wagon to the end of track. A single mile of track required roughly 2,500 ties. At peak construction, when they were laying 2 miles per day, that meant sourcing and transporting 5,000 ties daily. The pace of construction accelerated to levels that seemed impossible. In April 1869, the Central Pacific laid 10 miles of track in a single day. 10 miles. That's 52,800 feet of track. Each rail was 40 feet long and weighed 700 pounds. That means they moved and placed roughly 1,320 rails in 12 hours. Or they placed ties every few feet, roughly 25,000 ties. They drove 10 spikes per rail, over 13,000 spikes, each one hammered in by hand. The organization required to achieve this was military in its precision. The 800 Chinese workers were divided into specialized teams. One team carried rails from the supply train to the work site. Another team positioned the rails on the ties. Another team spiked the rails in place. Another team checked alignment and grade. The teams moved in sequence like a machine, each completing their task and moving forward as the next team took their place. White foremen with stopwatches timed each operation, identifying bottlenecks and adjusting crew assignments to maintain flow. The supply train kept pace with the crews, backing up as track was completed, then moving forward to deliver more materials. The coordination between the work crews and the supply train had to be perfect. If the supply train got ahead, it would block the work. If it fell behind, the crews would run out of materials and have to stop. The operation ran for over 12 hours without a significant pause. When it was done, Crocker had won his bet and proven that his Chinese workers could outperform any railroad crew in history. The 10-mile day was a stunt designed to prove the Central Pacific could outwork the Union Pacific. Charles Crocker made a $10,000 bet with Thomas Durant, the Union Pacific vice president, that his crews could lay 10 miles in a day. On April 28, 1869, Crocker assembled 800 Chinese workers and 100 white supervisors and foremen. They started at dawn and worked without stopping until after dark. When they finished, they'd laid 10 miles and 56 feet of track. It was a record that was never broken in the hand-laid track era. The two railroads met at Promontory Summit, Utah on May 10, 1869. The ceremony was elaborate. Dignitaries from both companies attended. Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific, and Thomas Durant, vice president of the Union Pacific, were both there. Photographers set up to document the event. A golden spike, actually made of gold, was prepared for the ceremonial final spike. The ceremony itself was strange. The Chinese workers who'd built most of the Central Pacific weren't invited to participate. They'd been sent away or kept back from the ceremony. The Union Pacific Irish workers were similarly excluded. And the photographs from Promontory Summit show company executives, engineers, and foremen. The men who'd actually built the railroad, who'd spent 6 years moving mountains with hand tools, weren't in the pictures. The absence of the workers from the ceremony was deliberate. The railroad companies wanted the completion to be celebrated as a triumph of American enterprise and engineering genius. They wanted the executives and financiers to be seen as the heroes who'd made it happen. The workers, especially the Chinese workers, didn't fit the narrative the companies wanted to present. They were an inconvenient reminder that the railroad had been built through exploitation of desperate immigrant labor. There was one exception. Just before the ceremony began, someone realized that the final rail still needed to be laid. The executives weren't going to do manual labor for the cameras, so a crew of 8 Chinese workers was brought forward to lay the last rail. They lifted it into position, aligned it, and stepped back. Photographers captured this moment. It's one of the few photographs from the ceremony that shows the actual workers. But even in this photo, the Chinese workers are positioned at the edges of the frame, almost as an afterthought. While the white executives and engineers occupy the center, Stanford and Durant took turns with a silver sledgehammer trying to drive the golden spike. Both missed. The crowd laughed. Finally, a railroad worker, his name wasn't recorded, stepped forward and drove the golden spike partway in with a few solid strikes. Then the executives took turns tapping it ceremonially. The final spike was actually driven by workers after the official ceremony ended. The golden spike was removed and replaced with a regular iron spike so trains could run over it. The golden spike went to Stanford and ended up in a museum. The ceremony was essentially for show, a piece of theater to mark the completion of something that had been built by 20,000 men whose names we mostly don't know. Telegraph wires had been connected to the ceremonial spike and sledgehammer so that when the spike was struck, a signal would be sent across the country announcing the railroad's completion. Cities from coast to coast waited for the signal. When it came, transmitted as a series of clicks representing the hammer blows, celebrations erupted. Church bells rang, cannons fired salutes, parades formed spontaneously. The entire nation celebrated the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. But in the camps where workers were packing up their belongings, preparing to move on to the next job or return home, there were no celebrations. The Chinese workers on the Central Pacific were given their final pay, minus deductions for food and supplies, and told to find their own way back to California or wherever they were going. Many walked. The journey from Promontory Summit to Sacramento was over 600 miles on foot. The Irish workers on the Union Pacific fared slightly better. The company ran special trains to take workers back to Omaha or other cities. But once they arrived, they were on their own. No severance pay, no assistance finding new work, just the wages they'd earned, which for many was barely enough to survive for a few weeks. The Transcontinental Railroad changed America fundamentally. Travel time from coast to coast dropped from 6 months to less than a week. The cost of shipping freight dropped by over 90%. Towns sprang up along the railroad line. The settlement of the West accelerated dramatically. The development of industries, mining, ranching, agriculture, all expanded because of reliable transportation. The economic impact is impossible to calculate, but was clearly in the billions of dollars over the following decades. But what happened to the men who built it? The Chinese workers were laid off immediately after completion. Most returned to California and took whatever work they could find. Many ended up in Chinatowns in San Francisco and other cities, working in laundries, restaurants, or as domestic servants. The skills they'd learned building the railroad, blasting, tunneling, heavy construction were valuable, but Chinese workers faced such severe discrimination that they couldn't get jobs in those fields. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 passed just 13 years after the railroad was completed, effectively banned Chinese immigration and stripped Chinese residents of many rights. The Irish workers scattered to other railroad projects. There was always railroad work somewhere. The transcontinental line was just the beginning of a national railroad network that would take decades to complete. Some workers saved enough money to buy land or start businesses. Others drank away their earnings or died young from injuries and disease contracted during construction. The Union Pacific didn't keep track of them after they stopped working. They were just labor, used and discarded. The death toll from building the Transcontinental Railroad is uncertain. The Union Pacific reported about 50 deaths among their workers, but historians believe the real number was probably 200 to 300. The Central Pacific didn't keep detailed records of Chinese worker deaths. Estimates range from several hundred to over 1,000. The true number of men who died building the Transcontinental Railroad is probably between 700 and 1,500, roughly 7% of the total workforce. Most died from accidents, falls, rock slides, premature explosions, cave-ins in tunnels, being crushed by equipment or rolling stock. Others died from disease, dysentery, typhoid, cholera. Some died from exposure in winter. Some were killed in conflicts with Native Americans. A few were murdered in the lawless camps, and some just disappeared, walked away from the work and were never heard from again, or died alone somewhere and their bodies were never found. The types of accidents that killed workers were often horrific. In one incident in 1867, a powder magazine exploded at a Central Pacific work site, killing 12 Chinese workers instantly and injuring 20 more. The explosion was caused by careless handling of black powder near an open flame. The force of the blast was heard 10 miles away. Body parts were found scattered over a 100-yard radius. The Central Pacific's response was to issue new safety guidelines and resume work the next day. In another incident that same year, a temporary bridge being used by the Union Pacific collapsed while a work train was crossing. The locomotive and 3 cars fell into a ravine. 7 workers on the train were killed. The bridge had been built quickly to allow supply trains to cross a gully using green timber that hadn't been properly seasoned. Under the weight of the train, the support beams failed. An investigation concluded the bridge had been inadequately designed, but no one was held responsible. The workers who died were Irish immigrants with no family in America to demand accountability. The tunnel work on the Central Pacific claimed the most lives, though the exact number is impossible to determine. The combination of bad air, unstable rock, premature explosions, and cave-ins created a constant hazard. There are accounts of entire work crews being buried alive when a tunnel section collapsed. The rescue attempts were often futile. The collapsed rock was too heavy to move quickly by hand, and by the time workers could dig through, anyone buried underneath had suffocated. One particularly tragic incident occurred in the Summit Tunnel in December 1866. A blast went off prematurely while workers were still in the tunnel. The explosion killed 6 men instantly and trapped 8 others behind fallen rock. The survivors on the outside could hear the trapped men shouting for help. They worked for 2 days trying to dig through the debris. They could hear the voices getting weaker. On the 3rd day, they broke through and found all 8 men dead from suffocation. They'd survived the explosion and the initial collapse, only to die slowly in the darkness, waiting for rescue that came too late. Disease killed as many workers as accidents. The camps were crowded, and sanitation was minimal, and medical care was almost non-existent. Dysentery, severe diarrhea caused by contaminated water or food, swept through camps regularly. In severe cases, dysentery would leave men so dehydrated and weak they couldn't work. Without proper treatment, many died. Typhoid fever, spread through contaminated water, killed dozens. Cholera, which causes rapid dehydration and could kill within hours, would occasionally outbreak in camps. When cholera hit, the standard response was to quarantine the affected camp and wait for the disease to burn itself out. The workers had no workers' compensation, no disability insurance, no death benefits. If you were injured and couldn't work, you were fired and left to fend for yourself. If you died, your body might be shipped back to your family if they could pay for it. Otherwise, you were buried in an unmarked grave near where you died. The Central Pacific would occasionally hold burials for Chinese workers, with ceremonies conducted according to Chinese traditions. But there were no headstones, no markers, just mass graves in remote locations that have been lost to time. The men who built the Transcontinental Railroad accomplished something extraordinary. They moved 114 million cubic yards of earth by hand. That's enough dirt to bury the entire island of Manhattan 10 feet deep. They blasted through mountains with black powder and hand drills. They crossed rivers by building bridges with hand-hewn timber. They laid track across deserts where the temperature reached 120 degrees. They worked through winters where the temperature dropped to 40 below zero. And they did it with pickaxes, shovels, wheelbarrows, sledgehammers, and determination. The tools they used were primitive. A pickaxe is a metal head on a wooden handle. You swing it to break up hard ground or rock. A shovel is a flat blade on a handle. You use it to move dirt. A sledgehammer is a heavy steel head on a long handle. You swing it to drive spikes or break rock. These are tools that haven't changed fundamentally in thousands of years. And with these simple tools, 20,000 men built a railroad across a continent in 6 years. The achievement is staggering when you think about the scale. 1,911 miles of railroad. That's 3,500 miles if you count both rails. That's over 18 million feet of iron. Each piece was moved, positioned, and secured by human hands. On every spike, over 10 million of them was driven by a man swinging a hammer. Every tie, over 3 million, was placed by workers lifting and positioning. Every cubic yard of earth moved. Every pound of rock blasted, every foot of tunnel dug, all of it done by human muscle. The Transcontinental Railroad is often celebrated as an American triumph, a testament to innovation and progress. And it was. But it was built on the backs of immigrants and laborers who received very little recognition for their work. The executives and engineers became famous. Leland Stanford became a senator and founded a university. The Big Four of the Central Pacific became wealthy beyond imagination. Thomas Durant of the Union Pacific died a rich man. The workers who did the actual building faded into obscurity. There are very few monuments to the Chinese workers who built the Central Pacific. There are a few to the Irish workers who built the Union Pacific. Most of the memorials focus on the completion ceremony, on the golden spike, on the executives and officials. The workers are mentioned in passing, if at all. Their names weren't recorded. Their stories weren't told. They built something that transformed America, and America forgot them. Today, if you drive across the country following the route of the Transcontinental Railroad, you can see traces of the original line. Some sections are still in use, others have been abandoned, the rails removed, the grades returning to nature. In places, you can see the cuts where workers blasted through rock. You can see the grades where they moved earth. You can see the routes they carved through impossible terrain. And if you stop and look closely, you can imagine what it took to build this. Imagine standing in the Nevada desert with a pickaxe, breaking up ground that's baked hard by the sun. Imagine working in a tunnel under 40 feet of snow, breathing air thick with black powder smoke. Imagine laying rail across the Wyoming plains in summer heat that's over 100 degrees. Imagine doing this for years, for wages that barely kept you alive, knowing that if you got hurt or sick, you'd be abandoned. The Transcontinental Railroad was built by men who had no other options. Immigrants fleeing poverty and famine, veterans trying to survive after a war, Chinese workers escaping even worse conditions in their homeland. They came to America looking for opportunity and found brutal labor that killed a significant percentage of them. But they built something that lasted. They created infrastructure that we still use today. They connected a continent. The railroad they built carried millions of people west. It enabled the development of cities, the growth of industries, the expansion of agriculture. It made America into an economic powerhouse.